So I'm Writing a Novel is the show where you join me, Oliver Brackenbury, on the journey of writing my next novel, from first ideas all the way to publication and promotion. In this one-man reality show, I'll share with you my ever-evolving thoughts and feelings on how I write, being a writer, and everything that entails at each stage of the process. I'll also interview special guests, and, when people send them in, I'll answer listener questions. If you're the kind of person who likes to learn how things are made and get to know the people making them, then this is the show for you. I'd like to say a quick thank you to our Patreon supporters who make this show possible. Patrons receive perks like getting to listen to the show a whole week early, and if you're not one already, you can check out all the other perks and exclusive content over at patreon.com/soimwritinganovel. Alright, last week was the 1-year anniversary show, and I'm very happy to say we're kicking off year 2 with an interview I'm very excited about. David C. Smith is an author whose career began in the 1970s during the second wave of sword and sorcery, and he still writes to this very day. Mostly known for his sword and sorcery or heroic fantasy works like Oron and the Red Sonja series he co-authored with Richard L. Tierney, David also writes horror and suspense novels, and, like yours truly, he loves to talk, which is partly why this interview has been split into 2 episodes. The rest of the responsibility for that is on me, of course, not only for my big mouth, but because there was just so much interesting stuff to discuss with David, covering decades of literary history and his development as an author. When you have such a great resource as David on the other side of the microphone, you don't want to be too broad, too general, you know? So I will encourage anybody who finds themselves hearing a lot of unfamiliar names to treat this as I did, an opportunity to learn about all kinds of new-to-you authors or publishers to check out after the interview is over. In this first half, we discuss how the 60s and 70s fanzine community played a crucial role in getting David's career going, how his first novel, Oron, came to be, what it might be like trying to encourage readers of the romance genre over to sword and sorcery, and a whole lot more. Okay, let's go hear what David had to say. And here we are with David. Hey, David.
Hi, Oliver. How are you?
Doing well. I've really enjoyed chatting with you before we press record. I can only think it will get better as we go along.
We're both talkers, so this is going to go fine, I think.
Yeah. So why not start at the beginning, eh? What got you, on the road of being a writer, and what brought you to sword and sorcery specifically?
I actually started out wanting to go into cinema, wanting to make movies, believe it or not. And I had really gotten interested in silent movies of all things. This is back when good luck finding any silent movies on TV, at the library or anything. But I got interested in those, and I got interested in movie making. My father, for my 16th birthday, got me a little Kodak Super 8mm camera. So I actually made some movies in high school, and there was a Kodak contest in 1969, I think, 69, 70. And my friends and I got a couple of awards for those. We made a Western, believe it or not, because friends of mine, their father, she was where I lived. There was some wealthy people that lived way out had these farms or estates, and he played polo, and he had polo ponies. So we actually got some shots of my friends wearing cowboy hats and being on horses. And we did a version of The Mummy, which was not very good at all. I was the mummy, and I was a little bit too pudgy in high school to be the mummy. But I decided I wanted to go into filmmaking. I really love filmmaking, and so my first stories were built that way. I didn't know what a script looked like, but I knew how to build scenes and so on because we pick it up by osmosis, of course, from reading and watching movies and stuff. But what happened was that I went to Ohio State for a year. They had just started their cinema program there. And I remember the professor's name, Wayne Schuth was his name. And he's really a good guy. He was pulling it together. But he said, if you really want to make commercial films, you need to be in New York or you need to be in California. Now, I'm from Youngstown, Ohio, you know. Actually, I'm from Liberty Township, Ohio, which is semi-rural. And here I am in Ohio State talking about this stuff. So I thought, oh, man, I don't know if I don't have money or whatever to get to those places. And at the same time, I was writing for English classes, and my English prof said, you write really well. Have you thought of being an English major? Well, not until that moment, I hadn't. So I switched my major to English, concentrated on that. Now, of course, I've been reading science fiction and fantasy, short stories and novels since I was in junior high school, even before that, And I had discovered the Conan stories in the Lancer editions with the Rosetta covers, And those things, those were incredible. In fact, the way I discovered them was, I don't know if you've ever heard of a magazine called Castle of Frankenstein. It was kind of like the poor cousin of Famous Monsters of Filmland. Oh, there's a great story about this. It was put together by some guy and his mother in New York. What's the name of this guy? And they had it published in Canada. And this thing it was small type. It was all kinds of photos. It was, rather than having large print and seeing the same stills over and over again, like an Ackerman's magazine, they were reprinting articles from, Cahiers du Cinéma in France, talking about French weird, it was incredible. It was incredible,
Cool. Yeah, you got the new wave. Yeah.
Yeah, all that stuff. And he's talking about Eyes Without a Face and all these fascinating avant-garde movies, along with classics like, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde and Frankenstein and stuff. This thing was incredible. It's like a gold mine. And if you love, bizarre stuff, it's just, you're just soaking this stuff up. I sure was. So, fun fact, you can cut this out, but the guy who ran the magazine became the model for the character in Psycho who kills the Janet Leigh character in Psycho.
Oh, Jesus. Norman Bates.
Norman Bates. Well, I guess Robert Bloch used to come into New York once in a while. Lynn Carter was part of this little group of people who would get together once in a while and have dinner. And this is honest to Christ truth. And this guy was so Calvin Beck. Look up sometime Calvin T. Beck.
Okay.
And he was kind of an odd duck, and he was the editor, and he lived with his mother, and she apparently henpecked him or controlled him or whatever. And I guess that got the motors moving for Bloch when you heard about this guy. Incredible how things intersect, and whatever. But in any event, yeah. So here I am, also subscribing to and reading Armor magazine and the Conan stuff. I read Lord of the Rings, and I never cared for Lord of the Rings that much. And I've been giving this some thought. And, it's kind of like the farther you get out from the center into shires and dragons and talking trees and stuff, that's legitimate fantasy. But what I learned about myself was that what I liked about Howard is that that's quasi-historical. And so it's more realistic, quote unquote. And that's the stuff I gravitate toward. So, and that's kind of my definition of sword and sorcery too, is it's got that grounding there, in that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I use that word exactly myself when I talk about it. It's this grounding that creates a kind of fun contrast with the weird elements so that the special things feel special.
Yes.
Whereas the more fantastical elements you add to something, I'm not saying I've never enjoyed anything with a lot of fantasy,
right.
Hoopla charging around. But yeah, I find it becomes less special and I become less engaged. And so that's partly why I've been so drawn to a lot of sword and sorcery. But, yeah.
That's very well put, because, see, if you have everything, I think it's kind of where the horror and terror stuff works in sword and sorcery, too. If you have the day going along just as it usually does, whether you're in Aquilonia or in Chicago, and then something outlandish or fantastic happens, now you're shocked, you're pulled into it. There's some emotional content there, and it's way out of what you expected. Whereas if your world is filled with dragons and talking trees and little elves and everything, it's just as you said. So that's why I like sword and sorcery, and you can build that gothic element, that mystery or tension, whatever there. And then when this thing erupts, I feel like I sound like I'm plugging my book, but it's kind of like you either live or you die. That's the point of sword and sorcery, is that you confront this stuff and you survive. You get to continue living. And to me, that's the point of sword and sorcery. That's what Howard developed. And there it is right there. So you confront this element or this force or whatever it is, and you win, even if you have your ear half chewed off or something.
Yeah.
And you're there for another day, and you really take a big gulp of air and you appreciate the fact that you're still alive. And to me, that's sword and sorcery. And then what distinguishes it from like detective fiction or war stories or police stories or whatever is that it's very frank about that element of horror or the fantastic, which we know is always there. All of us we know that's there somewhere in life. And these stories come right out and say it. It's like, yeah, here it is. And it's going to take this shape. It's going to be this monster or this, whatever the development might be.
There's going to be an elephant in that tower, yeah, so to speak.
Exactly right. Exactly right. And it's, it's the Chekhov thing, where, if there's an elephant in the tower, you got to confront the elephant. The gun is hanging over the mantelpiece, you got to use the gun. So.
But maybe not an elephant in every tower, because then you're back in high fantasy, yeah.
Exactly. And you have a whole bunch of elephants in rooms and they teach a class on how to do sorcery or something. Now you're way up. Yeah, exactly.
Now I just want to write a story about a city of elephants and towers. I have to have a think about that. But
you go for it. Go for it. You never, you sit down, you start typing, you talk to yourself, and you're there.
Although we say all this, I mean, I do occasionally find myself in the funny position of envying people who have a broader palette of enjoyment. Of course, there are many SNS fans who love Tolkien.
Oh, yeah.
And I don't dislike him. I actually have been enjoying rereading The Hobbit recently. My partner loves it. We've been rereading it together. But the main saga, I do find I still kind of bounce off it. I might give it another shot someday. But yeah, when it triggers my personal boundary of when everything's special, nothing is. Yeah.
That's so well put. Exactly. When everything is special, then nothing is. Exactly. That is so well put. And that's, which I thought of that, because that explains it perfectly. It really does. And you want to hold that in reserve, and then when it comes out with a punch or with an explosion or a roar or whatever, now you're really in the middle of something. There it is.
Yeah. So I'm wondering, in the back of your short story collection, Tales of Atuma, available now, you mentioned how.
You read that, yeah.
Yeah. No, I was very fortunate. A friend from actually the Whetstone Tavern Discord had a whole bunch of your books, and he was like, "Hey, I can ship them to you so you can read through them more quickly and stuff." And I was like, "Oh my god!
Oh my god! Was it Seth by any chance? Was it Seth?
No, username Dragoon Chuck. I believe his name is Chuck. Pardon me, Chuck, if I'm messing that up.
No, see, I have a fan. I have fans. So.
Oh yeah, no, I mean, I bet you're thinking of Seth Lindbergh, which honestly plausible. But no, it was not him. So yeah, Tales of Atuma. You have what I really appreciated both as a reader and as an interviewer, the interview in the back of the book.
Yes.
And in that interview, you mention how the 70s fanzine community was a big part of your development as a writer.
Yeah.
Could you please tell us all about that community and your part in it?
That was very much an element of the 70s. The late 60s, I'm sure, especially the 70s. This was maybe not the only way, but the way to communicate in print for those of us who were involved in this. Now, everyone knew about Armor magazine out of Philadelphia. Somehow or other there, or maybe, I don't know, maybe again in Space and Time, maybe Lynn Carter mentioned some of these fanzines. There was one called Herb Dumb, E-R-B Dumb, about Edgar Rice Burroughs. I subscribed to that for a while. And what were some of the others? But the main one was Space and Time, which Gordon Linsner in New York, he's still around, yeah, Gordon Linsner in New York put out. And I started subscribing in probably like the early 1970s, like early 1970 maybe. And this thing was kind of like the weird tales of the era in my mind. I mean, he was very generous. He published all kinds of stuff, science fiction as well as fantasy, poetry. He introduced new young artists and everyone. And it was in the letter columns of these fanzines that people got to talking and found out about each other. So I submitted to Space and Time, and Gordon was generous with me. He liked my writing, and I would send him something just about, like, publish it. I tried to do my best work. Half of what I sent him was horror. Half of what I sent him turned out to be, like, fantasy, sword and sorcery fantasy. There's one called The Diversifier, done by some brothers out in California. I sold them a couple. There was one called A Literary Magazine of Fantasy and Terror, which was done by Jessica Amanda Salmonson. Now, she's a trans person, and this predated that, What was the one there's one out of San Francisco, done by Dale Donaldson. And his deal was that he wouldn't publish a magazine and then saddle staple it or anything. He would print stories on triple punched colored paper and fold them in an envelope and mail them to you, so you could keep them in a binder. And that was his idea of keeping.
Oh, I love it.
Isn't it wild? So there was a ton of imagination in people doing these things. There was one that didn't print fiction. This is really like a talk board or whatever of the period. The guy, I forget his name, but it was just an ongoing conversation. And he would, I think it was mimeographed, but people would write letters and just talk back and forth. So you get a letter from somebody, I don't know, somebody in Poughkeepsie, right? And they're talking about Tolkien, or they might be talking about something science fiction, or it might go off on a tangent and talk about something topical, current events or something. This is the Vietnam War era, so there's a bit of that. And then he would print those letters. And then I think in the back of the book, there would be replies to people from previous letters. And some of this stuff would get into philosophy and stuff. Now, I graduated from college, and I was rather bright, and these ideas fascinated me. I don't think I ever did send him a letter, but it's kind of like message boards today. So you would have, he would publish the letter from the person, and then a reply, and then something else, and go on to another topic. And they just ran along like a scroll, as read through the magazine. So there was tons of ingenuity and all kinds of stuff going on.
Was a fanzine your very first sale?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, it was to Space and Time. When Linsner bought it, the story was called, it's very politically incorrect, The Apache Curse, Apache with an apostrophe, and set in the Old West, and about this racist old pioneer or cowboy or whatever who killed Apaches just because he hated them, And then he gets his comeuppance, at the end. So, yeah, in fact, once I started writing short stories, I read somewhere, I used to read Writer's Digest all the time, and someone said, boy, that first rejection slip from a publication, it really hurts. The zings, you gotta. Yeah. So I said, I'm going to get this out of the way immediately. So I wrote a very bad story called The Caves of Living Rock. And it's about a barbarian who goes into a cave, and sure enough, it's made of living rock, which tries to compress him, and somehow he gets out. Just god awful. But, I think not quite as bad as some of the Lynn Carter Spring to Camp ripoffs. They were fantastic. So I sent it to Fantastic. And sure enough, Ted White turns a cigarette around. We started to reject him, blah, blah, blah. And I pinned that thing up on the wall. It's like, fine. Now I've got past that barrier, So that was my first rejection letter. And after that, I just started writing. But most of the places I submitted to, if they didn't publish the story, they were very kind about declining it. They had a good reason for it. I just wasn't their kind of writer or something. So you kind of learn to do that, and you build a little bit of a shell, and they'll take it.
And I'm guessing the feedback you got in some of those rejections also shaped your development as a writer, Like, that's such a valuable thing.
It did, and that stuff would really come through, like the letters sections. Someone, I'd get a short story published, Mere Anyone, and then the next issue of the fanzine, there would be David Smith's story was very good, but I don't understand why he did this, or John, whatever story. And so, I'm picking something up at random here, but you get feedback.
Wait, I'm sorry. They published the rejection letters?
Oh, no. I would publish a story. No, I'm being unclear.
I misunderstood. Sorry. I thought, wow, that's intense.
I'm being unclear. So, Space and Time would publish, and then the next issue, people would write in and say, boy, I really like this story. It worked for me. Or someone would say, it kind of worked, but I didn't really understand this part, or, whatever it might be. Then in the letters column, just like in Weird Tales, back in the 30s, like, boy, Robert E. Howard really packs a punch, or I'm so tired of Conan the Chipmunk or something. And that's how you got feedback.
Yeah.
That's what the fanzines were so good for. I mean, they really were. So, and this went on for years. When I sold Oron, the novel Oron, 78, in 78, I kind of moved away from the fanzines then. I still had some stacked up that were printed later, but I was able to start writing sword and sorcery books for Zebra books. So that's what I did. And I didn't go back to the fanzines then, which is kind of too bad because it's such a great little market. But that kind of gets into what I was mentioning before we went on the air. There was this whole period there in the late 70s, early 80s, where you did have all this talent kind of concentrated around somewhat in the fanzines and then in publishing. And it was starting to do very interesting things with adventure fantasy, sword and sorcery, action fantasy. And then it kind of went nowhere. Publishing changed and moved into, more feminist fantasy and Tolkien type stuff and everything. And my only complaint was that why isn't there room for everybody? I mean, some of us still want to explore what we can do with sword and sorcery. And that didn't really happen. To some degree, you had like the Black Company and stuff like that. But there seemed to be some momentum there, and it dissipated.
Well, I do want to come back to that actually and get your 10 cents on when sort of the air got let out of the balloon a bit in the 80s.
Yeah.
But before we get there, I have a couple other things I'd love to ask you about. I mean, one, I just would love to run something by you.
Oh, yeah.
I've mentioned to you before we started recording that I've been chatting with a lot of other people about what can we do that's proactive rather than just having the same sort of complaints about, we wish more people read this stuff. And one thing that came up that was kind of interesting was, in fact, zines, because we have noticed, me and these people we've been chatting, certain people in the indie role-playing game community have had great success giving away or even selling short adventures in that format, always with information on how to find the publisher online at the end of the adventure, right? And
interesting.
We were thinking, what if we did something similar? Or what if we encouraged others to do something similar where perhaps a very short, like 1,500, 2,000 words, a very short sword and sorcery short story could be published as a zine, followed by like a body of links at the back of like, hey, did you dig this? Well, check out sword and sorcery in these various corners, get into it. I don't know. What do you think? Like,
that's good marketing. No, that's good marketing. Yeah, that's a good idea. That'd be a good tool. I think so. Who would the audience be? Would it be expansive enough to reach people? We just give it away. Is what I'm thinking. Cons.
Yeah, it feels like something you would print cheaply en masse, give away at conventions. That kind of thing. Include in the back of other stuff. I don't know. Yeah.
No, it's a good idea to build the audience. I know a little bit of when I was looking at the message board on what's it called.
Discord, the Whetstone Tavern.
I'm so old. Yeah, Discord. I'm so old. Discord. That they were saying how to reach out to a broader audience for sword and sorcery. And what occurred? A couple of things occurred to me. First of all, I distinguish sword and sorcery from heroic fantasy. And there's a lot of overlap, of course. But characters in heroic fantasy are motivated by something other than what motivates, the survival instinct of people in sword and sorcery. The other thing is that given that sword and sorcery it's kind of like raw meat and kind of has some teeth to it, does that or does that not limit its audience? Because some of the people online were saying, what if we try to attract readers of romance?
Yes.
And it's far and away the largest reading audience for fiction in this country. And I mentioned it to my wife, and she doesn't read a lot of romance, but she reads a lot of mysteries and stuff like that. She's like, I don't know. She read my books when she was in college. She liked them well enough. Different time, different place, maybe. It'd be worth trying. If you played up I want to say the romance angle, the heart interest or something, is it still then sword and sorcery, or is it more heroic fantasy? It's okay if it's heroic fantasy. If you want to go in that direction, what would the romance element be? If it's two strong characters building something, these two strong characters, male or female or whoever, broaden the audience. Have the a couple or whatever. But now is it something different from sword and sorcery, or is it, you kind of...
Well, I think about, because it's on my mind, as I mentioned before we started recording, I'm currently outlining a story that's kind of riffing off it. So People of the Black Circle, which I'm sure some people who know me are tired of me mentioning lately. But yes, People of the Black Circle, for listener, if you're not familiar, it's a classic novella-length Conan story, which, among other elements in it, there is a sort of, they snark at each other until they want to kiss each other, kind of, romance burgeons over it between Conan and the Devi Yasmina, princess of Vendaya, which is basically India, as I remember it. And by the end of the story, spoiler, sorry, lots of great stuff has happened. Please still read the story. But by the end, they kind of part in a moment of mutual respect, which I really enjoyed.
Yep.
But I feel like the romance version would be perhaps, instead of him, being like, well, I've got my responsibilities to my, my men. This drew me through this whole thing. And her being like, well, I've got my responsibilities to my kingdom, and tradition means I can't marry you. I could have you as a harem guy. And he's like, I don't know about that. Instead of them making the decision to prioritize a responsibility to others over their personal desires, I feel like you could make it a romance story by just flipping it and having them both go, you know what, actually, screw my kingdom. Yeah, screw my men. They'll be fine. I saved them. That's whatever, mission accomplished. And have them go off to build a life together and have further adventures. Boom, romance. You have a happily ever after at the end.
That's good. They could do that. And in fact, if you follow them then after that sunset and follow them to the next sunrise or something, maybe people in her kingdom would come after her and say, no, you have to do this. Or her men would come and say, no, you got to do that. And there's all kinds of interesting storylines you could then follow. And would it cause conflict for them? It's character. Mm-hmm. That's what I try to emphasize so much. And if you do that in the story, you kind of can't go wrong.
Well, yeah, and I mean, look, all I did was flip one thing at the end. Exact same story otherwise.
Yes.
So would you say that's not sword and sorcery because they wind up together at the end? I don't think so.
No, and it expands sword and sorcery. And you can still have the tough guy. There's still so many readers out there that want the tough guy alpha male character. And I understand. This fiction was born in the Great Depression. That's a constant for a lot of readers. You want to see that type of virile figure succeed no matter what. Detective stories, westerns, sword and sorcery, whatever. But if you don't do it right, it's just one-dimensional silliness. Yep. There's no irony. There's no sense of humor. And it's like, that's what you need for drama. That's what you need for character. I try to make sure every one of my stories have a little element of humor. Might be very dark humor, but that's why we've had funny characters in plays since the beginning of time. Well, you got to have that little relief valve, and then you come back and you amp it up, and you have the relief valve, and you come back and amp it up. That's the essence of drama there. So.
Well, absolutely, I agree, and I feel like I could go down this avenue with you for much further. Maybe we'll come back to it at the end.
Sure.
But I have this Word file I worked on very hard, gosh darn it, and I've got to work through these questions in order or my boss will get mad at me.
No, please do. I'm jabbering away here.
No. You're saying wonderful stuff. I love it. I just want to try and create a narrative in the interview. But that's me being a control freak. Also, it's very funny I say I have this Word file worked out. I feel decent about all my questions that I've got for you here, David, but I won't lie. My third question, I never quite got it down to anything more specific than like, tell me about the second wave of sword and sorcery. It sounds great. Because like, so if I can kind of own that vagueness and make it a little more answerable for you, then like, please tell me about an entire decade of publishing. Because I will say for someone like myself who is, trying to publish now, it can be a bit funny to look back and be studying, great authors from the first and second waves of sword and sorcery and be looking at, say, the second wave, which you got to be a part of, and be thinking, God, there was a midlist in publishing once? Oh, that sounds nice, And I don't think it was ever easy to make a living at it, but it seems more possible.
God bless you, because that's what happened with publishing. They got rid of the midlist. That's how I got in. You had that midlist there.
Yeah,
and they would take a chance on new writers, And I came out of the fanzines, and you had I was extremely lucky with this. I was briefly in the Esoteric Order of Dagon, the Lovecraft APA, because Dirk Mosig. Oh, this is very strange. You're gonna have to cut this out. This is very strange. I graduated college. I swear to Christ, this is what happened. I graduated college, and total nerd that I am. On rainy Sundays, I used to go to the stacks of the library of Youngstown State University, where I graduated. And they had a great library for this little mid-sized college in a steel town. They had the best library. I guess it had been endowed by people who made their fortunes in steel, And they had so many wonderful things there. And some of the stuff, I like ancient history, I'm intrigued by really ancient history and early civilizations. So some of the books they had there had been published like in the teens of the previous century, and someone had very carefully drawn the cuneiforms of Sumerian, tablets, and then they had transliterated those. So you would get all these Sumerian symbols. So you might get Ug, Ia, To, Ra, Ka, which, it almost seems like they must have spoken almost like pidgin or something, which I'm sure they didn't. And they never did translate them. They were still working on Sumerian dictionaries and stuff back then. And I'm reading this thing, Nagor, Ia, all these weird syllables. It sounded to me like the names of Lovecraft monsters, like the Great Old Ones or something.
Oh, yeah, Yog-Sothoth.
This can't be. Oh, so this is what it was like back then. This kind of spontaneous, you just start bouncing things around. It was very interesting. But you did it in slow motion, long distance, because you had to write letters. So I wrote a letter to, I think, Stuart David Schiff was at Whispers then. And I said, look what I found. Would this be of any interest to you? And I had this long list of these syllables that sounded like Lovecraft monsters. And he said, I can't use it, but I'm going to pass it along to a guy named Dirk Mozig, who teaches psychology. You heard of the name psychology at Georgia Southwestern University, way the hell down, and it was a few miles from Plains, Georgia, which is where Jimmy Carter was from. So I soon get a letter from Dirk Mozig. He said, this is fantastic stuff. He thought there might be something there. You never know, So through interlibrary loans with other libraries, he's a PhD, so he could order. He tried to track down if there was any, like this book or some other book from this earlier period that might have been in the Library of Providence. And maybe Lovecraft had come across it, whatever. And he kind of nailed one down. It was a possibility. We never really were able to ascertain that, But it was a goofy idea, but we followed it and stuff. So the result of this was that he and I started communicating back and forth. And he was a great guy. He was an awfully bright guy. Really, really a good guy. I went down to visit him, in fact, one time at his home when he was still in Georgia down there. Because after call, I would just hit the road and go visit people, I guess, So he mentioned the Esoteric Order of Dagon. You ever think about joining this? I don't know much about Lovecraft. I like Lovecraft. I'm kind of a Howard guy. But I joined it, and he said the editor, what they call him, the editor-in-chief. Anyway, the editor of the EOD then was Roger Bryant, the guy who lived in Akron, Ohio. Well, I was still out of college, living in my parents' house in Liberty Township. So I got hold of Roger Bryant, and so I'd go there and hang out with him and his girlfriend and some of his buddies, and he knew everybody in science fiction and fantasy. Roger was a wealth of information. He was a true fan and truly involved in fandom. I don't feel I ever really was. I was nervous about getting involved in fandom. I had to make a living and work at a job, lousy job and everything. What happened was that a couple of things. First of all, I decided, because I was turning out a fanzine, I decided to write a true Lovecraft pastiche. Not fan fiction. Scott Oden says stuff like Red Sonja and whatever. Those books are basically kind of fan fiction because we're not trying to write them in Howard's style. We're writing in his spirit. But a true pastiche should be trying to write in the style of Robert E. Howard or H.P. Lovecraft. So I did that, and I called it the Sign of Cthulhu, because there was a Cthulhu or something cuneiform. And, of course, the scientist involved is Dr. Derek Musag or something. I don't know, And, of course, the monster comes crawling through the window at the end, and it was a true Lovecraft pastiche. And there's slime on the floor afterwards or something. I don't know. And it was a hoot. We did it for fun. And so I got to meet him then when they used, I guess maybe they still do MinCons or Oktoberfest up in Minneapolis, St. Paul. There's a whole host. There was at that time a lot of fans up there in Minneapolis, St. Paul. And I'm new to all this. I'm just this nerd who just got out of college and was trying to write short stories. But in the course of discussing things with Dirk, I said, I've written this novel called Oron. It's kind of sword and sorcery, and it follows this heroic arc, like one of the old Greek heroes or something. You know, that was my take on it. Let me read it. Well, he didn't like sword and sorcery at all. You know, he was, you know, intellectual and like poetry and Lovecraft and everything. But he liked my story. I think because it was a downer, you know. It's like it doesn't do what these stories usually do. So he said, can I send it to Richard L. Tierney? He lives in St. Paul, Minneapolis.
Okay.
And he said, yeah. I had already ordered from Harry Morris Jr. Dick's first novel, The Winds of Czar. Because again, fans and fanzines all kind of cross-pollinate. So believe it or not, I went with Roger Bryant up to the MinCon. This would have been in, I guess, October of '75. I dared to leave my safe space and actually went on the road and met these people. And Dirk was there. And as I get out of the car with Roger, Dick Tierney is there. He's got Oron, the Oron manuscript. And I had The Winds of Czar. And he said, I really like your story. I said, well, I really like your story. And he asked if he could send Oron to a friend of his who had just gone to New York to try to be a literary agent. And that was Kirby McCauley. They'd been friends for years in the Twin Cities. Well, Kirby, of course, ended up being Stephen King's agent and all this stuff. But he did place Oron eventually. And I've now completely forgotten why I got on this track.
Oh, I had given you a fairly vague question. I was just saying, you know, it's funny. All my other questions are very specific, but my third one, I still have kind of written, you know, the midlist. What was that like?
Yeah.
It's interesting to read about publishing back then and read about contracts like, you know, a new author given 3 books. Publishers figured, well, maybe he'll get the knack of novels by the 3rd one. That doesn't exist anymore.
It was in retrospect, it may seem to me more free and easy than it actually was. It was unusual for me to have gotten that contract, you know, the way that I did. But there were writers, you know, I'm going to mention Andy Offit, you know, because what happened was that, like, you had people in Space and Time, and you had people in Diversifier and whatever. And I didn't know, but it makes perfect sense that some of the pros were paying attention to these things. And once in a while, someone would break out or try to break out or whatever. Now, we're talking very specifically here about the mid to late 70s, this very specific little time here, which was, to my mind, quite different from the 60s and early 70s, when there was a ton of schlock that was published, you know, by publishers. And, you know, you had the Gore series, and there were so many one-offs that were done. So many one-offs that were done. There were some good ones. There was one called Cavin's World or something by a guy named David Mason, and that one was pretty good. But publishers would look at this stuff. I'm sure you had to have an agent. I didn't have an agent. When I tried to sell Oron, I never tried Doubleday, and I don't have an explanation for that. I should have sent it to Doubleday. I tried Avon. I forget, somewhere I have the list. I still have my old notebook where I kept track of these things. But, you know, I would type the manuscript. This is like a 500 and some page manuscript, and it's in a stationery box. I don't even think they have stationery boxes anymore, but you'd buy Southworth paper, which is really good 20-pound bond paper that professional writers used, you know.
Oh, wow.
Type it up on that thing, on my Smith Corona or this old Remington from 1925 that I bought for the song. So I felt like a real pulp writer with this cast iron typewriter. I still have it. Wrap it, you know, put in a letter asking someone to read it. This is my novel. Would you care? And you cut apart a brown grocery bag and wrap that around the box with the manuscript and address it. And then after a while, it would come back with a rejection letter. And that's the way you tried to sell novels back then, if you didn't have an agent. And I did that so many times. Oh, God, that's so antiquated now.
I mean, yes and no. I mean, you know, there's still query letters and sending stuff out to publishers and trying to get an agent if you think that can help you.
Yeah.
I am happy to see fewer and fewer publishers asking for physical mailed manuscripts, though.
Yeah.
The very few that still do, I just kind of see that and I go, really? God, the shipping on that. Like, I don't want to...
Well, it cost a fortune. I mean, it really did. It cost a fortune. But because it was a mid-list, there was still the possibility of breaking in. Then you had, I mean, one of the things that really made things happen was Andy Offit with Swords Against Darkness. I'm trying to think. I think Dick had a Simon of Gitta story in the very first Swords Against Darkness. So that tells me that either he knew how to contact Andy. You know, I'm sure Kirby knew Andy. Andy had been president of the Science Fiction Writers of America. But yeah, so what happened was that David Madison had sent, I don't know if you heard of the stories, the Marcus and Diana stories
No, I'm afraid I haven't.
he had done for Space and Time. Talk about breaking the rules. Jessica Salmonson loved these stories, and for a good reason. They were kind of like Fatford and the Grey Mouser. That's the way I describe it in the book I'm writing. But Diana was the larger of the two. Okay, and she was a swordswoman and all this stuff. I suppose kind of like, was it the Brianna character in Game of Thrones?
Yeah, Brienne of Tarth, yeah.
That's it. And Marcus was more diminutive, and he was good with a sword and everything. And they were lovers, and they were companions on the road and everything. But it kind of like took that big tough guy thing with the diminutive little sweet princess thing and turned it on its head. So that was novel. So he'd sent that to Andy off, and Andy went, yeah, I like this. So that led Andy to discover Space and Time magazine. Ordered a stack of them, read them all, and found, I think, a couple of stories, not just mine, but maybe a couple of others that he liked. And so he plucked one of mine out to put into Swords Against Darkness 3. So one of my stories was in there.
Okay.
So the pros were aware to some degree of what the fans were writing in this little second wave here. The fans were writing for the fanzines. There were some writers who were doing things for publishers like Tarnsman of Gore and Cavan's World and stuff. And whatever you thought of them, they were there. And that was pretty much sword and sorcery. It had teeth in it. It was sword and sorcery, truly. So that's what it felt like. At the time, it was kind of amorphous.
Mm.
When you look back, you can say, oh, I can see some outlines to this. And it does seem a little fluid. There was a way of moving up and getting the attention of paperback publishers. You didn't just have to stay in the fanzines.
Well, thank you so much for giving us some insight from someone who experienced it, because, let's say, looking back as an author trying to get published now, you just kind of see a shape of it and you hear broad stories, but it's obviously not the same thing as having been there. If I can ask you a hyper-specific question about that period,
sure.
Maybe a little later this might have been, I'm not sure.
Mm-hmm.
Word on the street, as a friend of mine wanted me to phrase it. Word on the street is, by which I mean a friend of mine who's also a Karl Edward Wagner scholar. I mentioned to him I was going to be...
Oh, sure. Yeah, okay.
Yeah, I mentioned to him I was going to be speaking with you. And this KEW scholar buddy, he sent me the following message when I mentioned I was going to be talking with you. He said, I don't know for a fact, but I'm, my friend, pretty sure I heard Smith was hired to jump in and write the Bran Mac Morn book Karl never finished, Witch in the Mist. Is there any truth to that?
Quasi-truth. Yeah, what happened was that we didn't finish the novel that Karl never did, meaning Dick Tierney and I. So we were hired to write another Bran McMorn novel. Karl's book was Queen of the Night.
Oh, okay.
And there's even a cover for it you can find online. They printed a cover for it. And he either never wrote it or never completed it, being Karl. Zebra, Kirby had shown the manuscript of Oron to Roberta Grossman at Zebra Books. And I assume she read it, or maybe Roy Torgerson was there by that time. I'm not sure if Roy was there yet or not. He was the editor I worked with a little while later at Zebra. So she knew I could write reasonably well. And I could write Robert E. Howard type stuff. So Karl, by that time, he wasn't coming through with his Bran McMorn novel. And so Kirby said, would you write a Bran McMorn novel for us? And I said, man, I'd love to. I'd really love to. And so I wrote the first chapter and the outline for a book that I called For the Witch of Mists, without the mists in there. And I realized only years later that there had been a Conan story that Lynn Carter and Sprague de Camp had written for Fantastic called The Queen of the Mists or something like that. I had forgotten that story or just seen it on the newsstand, and I ended up borrowing that title. So I apologize to them, much later here now. So I submitted that, and they didn't decline it, but Kirby got hold of me and said, never mind about that story. Looks like Karl's going to write the book after all.
Oh, okay.
Would you write us a pirate story? So he sent me the Don Grant book of Terrence Vulmea stories. So I read that. I love pirate stories. Who doesn't like pirate stories? So I said, man, it's my chance to write a pirate story. So I kind of ignored what Howard had done. I kind of wrote the pirate story I wanted to write, which nobody complained about it. It's not like Black Vulmea was a really well-known Howard character, and we were all having fun anyway. So I wrote Witch of the Indies, and sent that in, and that was accepted. And so then that ended up being my first published book in early 78.
Okay.
Then I heard back from Kirby, and he said, now they want you to go ahead and write the Bran McMorn novel. I'd like you to write it with Dick. You and Dick write it. And I was like, okay, I don't care. That'd be fine. I met Dick. I like Dick, So we used the outline that I wrote, and that's what we based that novel on. It was not based on what Karl had come up with at all. It was our own.
Oh, okay.
My idea was to have like Bran McMorn, like King Kong, taken in chains to the big city to fight in the arena. That idea came from me. Thank God Kirby got Dick to co-author it, because I am not a historian of ancient Roman history. Dick is, very much. So I got a lot of things wrong when I wrote my first draft, and Dick cleared up all of that stuff. So all of the Roman stuff in there is from him, and he really shaped it, well, to feel like you're back there in Rome. So, but yeah, I hope that clarifies it.
It absolutely does.
When Karl heard that I was going to write a Bran McMorn novel, he seemed to have been very kind about it. I actually got a letter from him.
Oh.
And he said, congrats, good luck writing the Bran novel. You're a good choice or whatever. So he knew who I was. And he enclosed an essay he'd written about Bran. Is Bran a breakfast cereal or something? And the research he'd done on the Bran McMorn character. So it was very kind of him to do that. It's the only time we ever communicated. I never met him. But that was very nice of him to have done that. So there wasn't any animosity or anything, but we didn't complete the novel.
Okay, cool. Well, thank you so much for that story. I really appreciate it. And I have no doubt my friend, the Karl Scholar, will also appreciate it. Mm-hmm. And hopefully some other people listening. No, I'm sure they will.
No, it's an interesting period in history, because, the farther back it goes and the more you look back at it, it does take a kind of shape, like anything in the past.
Yeah.
And you can kind of see stuff there that you didn't notice when you were there.
David C. Smith interview part 1 ends here. I really hope you'll join us in only 1 week's time, not the usual 2, for part 2, in which we start with David's take on the collapse of sword and sorcery in the 80s, and move on all the way through to what he's up to today. So I'm Writing a Novel features original intro and outro music by Gloria Guns, and is hosted by yours truly, Oliver Brackenbury. If you'd like to submit a question, then please email it to soimwritinganovel@gmail.com. You can also holler at the show on Twitter. Look for @so_writing. That's @so_writing. Please consider sharing the show with anybody who might like it, or checking out any of the other ways you can support the show by heading to soimwritinganovel.com/support the show, which has things like links to our Patreon, Coffee, PayPal, all that stuff. Thanks for hanging out with me and David, and we'll see you soon.